All right, welcome back to the morning show here on the Rise News. I'm Rafai Hosseini.
I'm Adesoa Omarwan.
And I'm Shaiton Atigari. Good morning.
Right, the recent proposal to increase VAT and deepen the tax collection net in Nigeria has generated a lot of reaction. The government, in its defense, says Nigeria has either to a low tax GDP ratio of about 6%. But due to the stark realities of economic contractions in Nigeria, the government has instituted various tax increment measures to be able to facilitate infrastructural development in Nigeria.
That's correct. But industry experts say this will stifle growth prospects in the country. Recently, Deloitte, a consultancy firm, pointed out varying taxes for businesses numbering about 39 and berated the government on the ease of paying these taxes.
However, the federal government, going one step further, is proposing a tax on soft drinks. This is also generating reactions from the food and beverage sector. Manufacturers in this sector are already complaining of poor infrastructure, heavy taxation, lack of access to raw materials locally, and stifling logistical challenges they face in transporting their products.
Right, little wonder this has frailed a lot of business nerves and business owners, but a clear understanding is rife in a bid to project necessary economic outlooks on business climate in Nigeria. So joining us to talk about this proposed soft drink tax and soft drink issues on taxation is Yomi Olugbenro, a tax partner, a tax leader. They call themselves at Deloitte. Welcome to the show. It's a joy having you.
Welcome
Thank you
to
so
the
much.
show.
Good morning. Good to be here again.
You know, we just mentioned about 39 different taxes, and now our soft drinks aren't safe anymore. Do you think that this is a necessary way to generate revenue, or this is just making it more difficult for manufacturers?
Well, the list isn't actually 39. I don't know if that helps or wasn't the case. We have close to 55 different taxes and levies. 55 different taxes and levies that is collectible by the various tiers of government. So the thoughts around soft drink tax, or what we call carbonated tax on carbonated drinks, is actually one of the areas the government is thinking to raise tax revenue. And it's not new, actually. Prior to 2008, we used to have different items that are eligible for excise duties. So by excise duties, we mean the taxes you pay on locally manufactured goods. So the list used to be very long, of items that are subject to excise duty. But from 2009, the list got reduced to basically two groups of items, tobacco and alcoholic drinks and beverages. So your wines, your spirits, your beer, your stouts. So those two classes of items are eligible for excise duty. When they are manufactured locally, the manufacturers pay 20% in excise duty.
Is this any different from the sugar tax? And if it is, should we be looking at the sugar tax instead? This is backed by the World Health Organization, implemented across several countries to cut unhealthy consumption of these soft drinks, carbonated drinks, some people call them. Is there any difference between this excise duty the federal government is proposing and a sugar tax?
Yeah, so what the federal government is proposing is to actually include, these taxes on carbonated drinks, which some other countries call sugar tax. Some call it sin taxes. So they call sugar tax or sin taxes because in many of the countries where they are introduced, they are aimed to prevent certain health conditions. All right, so they are more medically induced than, for the health benefit rather than for just the tax revenue. So prior to now, we don't have excise duties on your typical soft drinks, all the sugar-coated drinks that you have all around. So only alcohol, wine, spirit, and beer. So the government is saying we now need to extend that list to include all those carbonated drinks. And it's still a proposal. If that's going to be approved or secure the consent of the president or the Federal Executive Council, that's still to be seen.
Another thing that comes to mind, a lot of people, when you talk to them on the streets of many parts of Nigeria, from Potiskum to Lagos, will tell you that these taxes are getting too much. At first, the USSD, that's another kettle of fish. Banks, the telecoms company are saying that this is increased. Telecommunications taxes, we've heard about that. It's about going through the second reading now. We are hearing this sugar tax, this soft drink tax, increasing VAT at the same time. So people are crying, and we know. See what happened in Chile recently. Just an increase in metro prices, transportation prices. The whole country is gonna flame. What is happening? That's what a lot of people are asking.
I mean, that's quite true. So, but what we should also realize is that the country is going through some very difficult situation. So, what the Finance Ministry came up sometime last year is this initiative called the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative, so SRGI. And the Minister of Finance and Budget and National Planning also alluded to that during the presentation of the budgets after the President presented at the National Assembly. So there are key elements of that revenue growth initiative. Some of them talk to these new streams of taxes that the federal government is looking into. So there are attempts to improve and optimize collection of existing taxes, block loopholes, chase after defaulters, but government also realized that that will take us just this far, all right? And there need to be some new items that needed to be added on to expand the base of what the government is going to collect. But the whole question, touches the point you're raising. So how many of those taxes is good for an economy? So an economy where the entire tax-paying community is complaining about the ease of paying taxes, they're complaining about the multiplicity of taxes and levies. I just mentioned the fact that we have at least 5 different items of taxes and levies. Some are just fees and rates and charges, but at the end of the day, businesses are meant to comply. Businesses have some reporting obligations, and beyond the quantum, beyond the financial impact, the administrative burden of complying with different type of taxes. We just have a police force levy, recently introduced. There's a communication tax bill that is at the National Assembly. VAT is being proposed to be increased. So a more holistic look, at our entire taxing structure.
But how much is it coming to? I mean, a lot of people are arguing that when you look at the numbers from the VAT, it doesn't still move the needle as regards infrastructural development. Look at this sugar taxes now. There's some reason cited, by people is the fact that the reason why Nigerians consume about 38.6 million liters of fizzy drinks or soft drinks as at last 2 years, that's 2016, was because we don't have infrastructure for potable water.
And I agree totally with you.
How about fixing that?
I agree totally with you, because sometimes we introduce policies and practices from other climes that is induced by a totally different behavior. In the UK or many of the advanced economies, for example, the price of a bottle, maybe 30 cl of water, is probably much more expensive than the price of Coke and all of the soft drinks that you buy all around. And so a lot more people consume those. All right, but government is able to do that because there's avenue for you to have very clean and potable water. In Nigeria, there are rumors that the only reason why people drink many of those carbonated drinks is because you don't even have access to clean, and potable water. So sometimes we need to evaluate the impact of many of those policies and whether these policies apply the way they apply in many of the jurisdictions, where they already been applied. And do they have as many taxes and levy, for example?
And that brings me to my next question, because there's an argument that this is a retrogressive tax if it should go into effect, because the argument is that majority of those who consume these drinks are the poor people. And so it ends up being the poor people who are heavily taxed when it comes to this taxation. Do you agree?
Well, I think a lot more data needs to be brought into our decision-making table, right? So we actually need to understand, maybe also beyond the revenue, from the health perspective. So what percentage of Nigerians, for example, are diabetic? So what's the liter, what's the quantum, of this carbonated drink that are being consumed in Nigeria? So that maybe if we change the narrative from government only just wanted to make more money from the health benefit. This is the percentage of Nigerians that are obese and diabetic because they consume this kind of product, and because we needed to control their consumption, and improve the life expectancy of people and improve the living style of people, then we're introducing this kind of taxes. Maybe the acceptance and the reception, by the people will be different. For now, the only reason why it's been talked about is because we're talking about it from a revenue generation standpoint.
How much revenue is it going to generate, really?
We haven't seen the data. But what we know is that whether it's a VAT or customs and excise or the entire tax revenue, the quantum of that amount of revenue being generated to our GDP is completely very low and disgraceful sometimes when you compare to the likes of ECOWAS, and the rest. We're talking about VAT. Our VAT to GDP is not up to 1%. The 1% to GDP. The average in West Africa is nearly about 7%. Or thereabout. Tax to GDP is about 6%. The average within our sub-region is within the range of 15, 16, 17 and a half. So what we know is
even
that...
Benin does 15. So Ghana does 15, 16, 17.
And that, for me, explains the reason why the solution isn't just by introducing new streams of taxes. We need to optimize the existing number of taxes. In fact, if anything should be done, it should be around consolidating the number of taxes and levies that we have, and focus on improving compliance, focus on driving, the penetration much deeper than we
Yes, one of the things that the finance minister mentioned was the low tax morale of Nigerians, and she had said that they were working on strong strategic communications process to educate Nigerians on the need of paying their taxes. Now, you are in this sector. How do you reckon that we start to, because it's an anomaly for us to depend fully on oil and gas for our revenue generation. Whether or not we have 55 taxes, we still struggle with even paying what we have. How do we make that change so that it gradually begins to move from oil and gas to other things that we should be taxed for?
Right. So I think the point you're speaking to, which comes straight from a survey done by the NESG, is that there's actually a breakdown of, if you like, social contract or trust deficit. Sometimes we focus on the citizens and talk so much about how they're not paying taxes, how the tax to GDP ratio is low. We also sometimes forget that some of this behavior is also influenced by the way the citizen sees the openness, the accountability, the transparency, the prudence, on the part of the government. So sometimes this argument isn't just one way. And unless we deal with the social issue, unless we deal with the perception issue, unless we deal with the trust deficit issue, we're not going to be able to solve that problem. So the citizens want to see that when they part with their money in taxes, there's judicious utilization of that revenue, and government feel accountable, and government, apply the proceeds of those revenue to projects that can be seen, that can be verified, and there's a direct link between what they're parting with and the benefit it seems they're enjoying. So many of the countries where we talk about high tax morale or high tax to GDP ratio, you will see some connectivity with development on the ground. So until the government also realizes that we need to entice the taxpayer to see their taxpayers' money in action, the willingness to part with money wouldn't be there. I've had people talk so blatantly about how they know they're not doing the right thing. In fact, it's covered by those surveys. 70% of the people did acknowledge that they're not paying the right amount of taxes, and they feel so good with themselves they are not so doing because they can't see any justification.
I want to be a little bit cheeky. So if they say on carbonated drinks, what if I have something like mineral water that is carbonated? Or what if I have, flavored water that is carbonated? We'll talk much about this when we come back, because I want to see how the breakdown goes.
Right.
When we say carbonated drinks, is it just the fizzy ones? But you have some water constituent drinks that are carbonated. Mm-hmm. Right. We forget in a hurry that carbonation is a state of water.
That's correct.
So if I go through the process of just providing something that is carbonated, how do you tax me? I will come back after the break and talk more about this. You're just joining us to very exciting conversations right here on the Rise News channel. We're talking to Yomi Olugbenro, a tax partner with Deloitte. Before we went on that break, I was talking about Carbonation is a state of water itself. I mean, you can put in gas into it and, make it carbonated water. So how are they going to... I don't know. I just explain it through, because I'm sure the manufacturers of fizzy drinks are looking at, okay, let's say we can cut color. So does it include flavored water and the likes? I mean...
Well, you're right. I'm not a scientist, and my knowledge of chemistry is rusty now. But what I know happens with the HS code and the classification is that the book actually attempts to be very wide, provide wide coverage for every kind of product, and all of that. So whether it's carbonated water, whether it's drink, whether it's, whatever is the sugar content, and all of that are usually described. And sometimes you have discriminatory rates depending on the content of sugar, and all of that. So what you will expect with this kind of initiative is that if it eventually get the green light from FEC, it would have been preceded by some form of classification so that items that are covered are understood and those that are not covered are understood. So the attempt would be to make sure that you close the gap as much as possible so that manufacturers can play...
How do they charge currently? Do they charge per centiliter of drinks? I mean, the initial regime, before it was stopped in 2008, how did they charge for that?
All right, so the regime we had from 2009 or thereabout actually extended up until May 2018, last year, just mid-year last year. So it used to be ad valorem, meaning you charge a certain percentage on the value. So for alcohol, wine, spirit, cigarettes, and tobacco, you pay 20% of the value of those products. That's what we used to have. But from 4th of June or thereabout last year, we then have...
Who pays the tax? The manufacturer or they pass it on to us?
Well, definitely they pass it on if they can. So
with this, price of fizzy drink will definitely increase.
That's what you will expect. But we've had experiences in other part of jurisdiction where the manufacturers are able to optimize their production processes and they reduce the cost of production so that the amount passed on to the consumer it's moderated in a way.
Okay, so the price on the alcohol, how was alcohol tax, how was tobacco tax?
So I was saying both, all of them were taxed at a single rate before, prior to June 2018. But from June 2018 up until now, so it's now a mixed rate. So some are at quantum, as we call it. So a fixed rate based on the liter. So, for example, for beer and stout, you pay, I think it's about 30 kobo per centiliter. For wine, you pay about 1.25 kobo for a certain quantity, and then for spirit, which appear to be the highest, you pay about 1.50 kobo per centiliter, if I remember the metric quite well. So, and I mean, manufacturer of spirit has actually been fighting this with the federal government because they think, I mean, the difference between 30 kobo that you pay per centiliter or so for beer and stout is completely too disproportionate to 1.50 kobo that you pay in the case of spirit. So that conversation is ongoing at the moment. So when the extension then covers carbonated drinks, we would then need to see at what rate will that be brought in. Will it be brought in at a rate lower than beer and stout, for example, or will it be at the same rate, or is it going to be at the rate of spirit? And the rate is actually graduated. So if you look at what came up under the then finance minister, there was 2018 rate, 2019 rate, and 2020, and it was graduated progressively in that particular manner. So all of those are still being challenged to see whether we can have uniformity and we can bring some of the rates down.
Let me just speak on what Rufai and Shaitan had said earlier. Rufai talked about numerous taxes, and Shaitan was talking about the minister's idea of diversifying our income revenue, our revenue sources. I think it was the minority leader in the Senate, Senator Abaribe, that said that the 2020 budget is a budget of taxation, and the minister is basically saying that we need to start focusing on a tax-based budget in Nigeria. And I wonder if that is achievable. Or is this just a wishful thinking of the minister?
Well, it will be disastrous for all of us if it's just a wishful thinking. But the truth is that over the past years, we haven't done well on our revenue. And for me, if there was anything I took away from the budget for 2020, is the fact that for the first time, it seems to be a lot heavier on revenue than what we had in the prior year. So many a times when budget speeches are released and budget numbers are released, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to analyze what percentage is capital, what percentage is recurrent, what percentage is debt. If you go to read and get acquainted with the actual delivery of those budgets, you will be seriously disappointed, because at the end of the day, sometimes we don't even move up to 30 or 40% of capital expenditure. So the only thing that we implement is essentially recurrent expenditure and debt servicing. Capital, the portion of capital project that eventually gets executed, it's quite low. And the reason is very simple. It's the shortage of revenue. As at for 2019, or maybe for 2019 budget, for example, as at the time the president was presenting the budget speech, he said by mid-year, we've only achieved maybe about 52% of our targeted revenue, maybe just about 2 trillion. And we've spent maybe over 3 trillion on debt servicing and recurrent, 0 on capital.
That's just a little above past.
As far as 2019 budget is concerned, yes, you could say that the reason why we didn't spend on capital for 2019 as at that time was the delayed passage. I think the 2019 budget was passed maybe around May or thereabout, and we only have the first release maybe in the 3rd quarter. But the truth is that over the years, there's always been challenges with the amount of revenue that is available. So for me, I'm delighted with the fact that we all seem to be awoken to the fact that our biggest challenge isn't just the deficit in infrastructure, but also the amount of revenue. So, but the conversation should be a lot more holistic, because you can't just go all out because you want to raise revenue and you're further impoverishing the already beaten and downtrodden tax-paying community. So that's where the conversation should start. And I'm liking the fact that a lot of talks are now ongoing around the desirability of new taxes, whether we should compress, whether we should stagger, and all of that. Those kind of conversation is what we should be doing. So with a new focus, we may not achieve 100% of what the desired revenue is. For 2020, I think it's about 8 trillion naira revenue. We may not get that far, but if we focus the way we're doing, I think we'll be closer than we've been in the prior years.
But is it viable raising the revenue target from about 7 trillion last year that you didn't achieve to about 8 trillion? Is it viable when you don't even have those means, when we've not diversified the economy, when we're not looking at solid minerals and the like? It's still pretty much crude oil dependent.
But those who are familiar with the government setup will also acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of inefficiencies within the revenue generating agencies, and all of that. I think we can close the gaps a little more. We shouldn't actually be talking 8 trillion naira from, this size of an economy. It's an anomaly. If we're doing 20 trillion from an economy of our size, it won't be far-fetched. But we need to do a lot with, empowering the revenue generating agencies. Let's optimize the process. Many of the reform and initiatives happening around digitizing the process, leveraging technology, making sure that we close the gaps at those who are not complying. I think if we focus on it with a lot of political will, I think we will move the revenue far higher than even the 8 trillion naira that's been budgeted.
Her plan is to develop the domestic tax base and harness the full potential of revenue mobilization. So from where I'm sitting, it looks like we're just getting started with the new tax policies that are going to be introduced. Do you think, in your opinion, is there anything that should remain out of bounds when it comes to collecting tax on certain things? Because we'll be here next week talking about,
water being taxed, bottled water.
So what I think should be out of band. I mean, nobody likes paying taxes. I think we must acknowledge that. So even in countries where they have higher compliance rate, is driven by their perception of how this is being used. We have several jurisdictions where if you work for 12 months in a year, maybe 6 months out of those is used to pay taxes, and all of that. But somehow you can live with it because you understand your medical, all of the basic amenities that you will need to survive is being provided for by those taxes that's being collected. So that's why many of those comply. So for me, talking about Nigeria, so if we're going to say what should be out of bound, I think for me it should be the increase that we're having almost every day in the number of taxes and levies. It's just displeasing, to see. I acknowledge the fact that we need to raise more money, but I don't agree that the only way to raising those tax revenue is by increasing the number of taxes and levies. There can be a lot more efficiency. There can be a lot more probity. There can be a lot more accountability. There can be a lot more tone at the top. So when those who are seeking political offices and those who are leading us are showing evidences of how much they are also contributing to the national purse, so that you can increase the interest and the desire and the willingness of the public to participate. But if what you have is only those who are in paid employment, who are being harassed by the employer, who don't have any ways of hiding away from the taxman, if that's the percentage of people who are paying taxes, we haven't started. And the current statistics says close to 96% of those who are paying personal income taxes, for example, are those who are doing so through the pay-as-you-earn scheme. They're just employees. So where are the big business owner? Where are those the VIP? So how much are they paying in taxes? Why are we having less than 1,000 people paying 10 million naira? So where are those people?
Currently, as we wrap up, President Trump has been haggled many times in America because he's not showing his tax filings.
Yeah.
When are we going to have in Nigeria where politicians, we have to see the tax returns of politicians before they can even vie for any position? When are we going to have that in Nigeria?
I think we're closer there than ever. And I'll tell you why. The reason is because as more and more citizens are being harassed, and I'm using the word very carefully. So as more and more people are being harassed and finding it difficult to hide away from paying taxes, it will come to a time that everyone will find their voices and will challenge, their leaders. They will challenge their political office holder to say, you need to be more transparent. So the era of 50,000 naira tax clearance certificate to seek, an elective office should be over. People should be demanding accountability.
Thank you so much, Mr. Olugbenro, for being on the show this morning. We'll see how all of this will actually pan out and how we can hopefully increase our revenue without taxing the overtaxed Nigerians.
Okay.
Thank you so very much.